I always believed family meant safety, that no matter how bad life got, blood would stand by you. That when the world turned its back, home would still be your shelter. But I was wrong. Sometimes, the people you trust most don't stab you in the back, they do it with a smile, while calling you brother. My name's Aaron. And this story begins right after my father passed away. He wasn't a rich man, not by any measure, but what he left behind was more valuable than money. A small house, built with his own hands, brick by brick, memory by memory. It wasn't grand, just 2 bedrooms, a creaky porch, and a backyard full of Dad's half-finished projects. But to me, that house was sacred ground. It held my entire childhood. The scent of my mother's cooking, Dad's laughter echoing through the hall, and the sound of rain hitting the old tin roof on nights when the world outside felt far away. My younger brother, Ryan, and I stood together at the funeral that day, 2 sons burying their father. He cried harder than anyone. He hugged me tight, whispering, "We'll stick together, Aaron." Oh, it spud even through the tears. I saw that flicker in his eyes. Something cold, calculating, like he was already thinking ahead, not about grief, but about gain. After the burial, everything felt hollow. The house felt too quiet, like it was mourning with me. I tried to move forward, going back to my job, fixing broken pipes, keeping up with bills, doing the little things Dad used to handle. Ryan, on the other hand, drift-toed. He lived across town, bouncing from one temporary job to another, always chasing easy money, always with a new excuse. Still, he was my brother. And every time he called, sounding desperate, I helped. Gas money, sometimes rent, I told myself. That's what family is for. But I never noticed how he always took and never gave. Then one morning, everything changed. I was sipping my coffee, sorting through mail, when I saw a thick white envelope from the county registrar's office. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe tax paperwork, maybe an update. But when I opened it, my hands went cold. It was a notice confirming property title transfer for my house, and my name was no longer listed as the owner. My first reaction was confusion, pure disbelief. There had to be a mistake, a typo, something. But as I kept reading, a chill spread down my spine. The document clearly stated that both parties, both brothers, had signed the transfer. Both brothers. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands started trembling as I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to the registrar's office. I don't even remember the drive, just the pounding in my chest, the way my pulse echoed in my ears like war drums. When I got there, the clerk looked at me with polite confusion. "Sir," she said, scanning the screen, "the property transfer was processed last week. Both signatures were verified. The system shows everything is complete." "Both signatures?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She turned the monitor toward me, and there it was. My signature, my handwriting, my name. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. But I never signed it. The room started spinning. I could barely hear her explaining the process, her voice fading into static. I felt something collapse inside me, not just shock, but betrayal, because in that moment, I knew exactly who had done it. Ryan, my own brother, the same man I helped, the same man who cried at our father's grave. He had forged my name, my trust, and stolen the one thing that connected me to my parents. It felt like losing my father all over again. Except this time, it wasn't death that took him away from me. It was blood. Asterisked when I opened the front door that evening. The house smelled the way it always had after rain, wet wood, and old polish, but the sound inside felt wrong. The rooms were the same size, the same furniture, but something invisible had shifted. The house that held my childhood had been rewritten without my consent. Every picture frame, every dent in the banister, every faded baseball glove on the shelf suddenly felt like evidence in someone else's story. I called Ryan before I let myself think too long. Phone in hand, felt heavier than usual, like a brick I was carrying toward a cliff. "Hey bro, everything okay?" His voice was casual too, casual. There was no tremor, no pause, no guilt. Just that slide of easy confidence he'd always used to hide whatever he was up to. My throat went dry. "Ryan, what did you do? You transferred the house papers?" Silence stretched for a beat, then a soft chuckle, like he was amused by my shock. "You're overreacting, Aaron. Dad always said the house belonged to both of us." Those words landed like a fist. My hands started to tremble without meaning to. He told me it was my responsibility. I said, "I was there when he was sick. I sat through nights watching monitors and changing sheets. You barely came by. You left." There was a long dramatic sigh on the other end, the kind people use to make you feel like you're being unreasonable. "Look, man, I helped in my own way. You think that just because you stayed, everything should be yours? That's not how family works." Family, the word had hollowed out in my mouth. He said it with the same ease. He used to borrow money and never return it, family. I repeated, the bitterness cutting sharper than I expected. "You have a nerve saying that while you steal from me." He went quiet, a silence that was smug and planned, the kind that said he'd thought things through and saw me as a problem to be solved. Then, slow and composed, he said, Maybe you should talk to my lawyer, Aaron. It's legal now. Double quotes. Click. The line went dead. Not even a hollow apology. Not a stammer. Just the kind of decisive end that meant he had already moved on from me and his head. I stood in the hallway with the phone pressed to my ear like an anchor. And for a while the world narrowed to the trembling of my hands and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I tasted metal, the metallic tanks of anger, or maybe of old coins, and the house around me seemed suddenly small. The porch light a lighthouse for someone else's ship, but that night's sleep refused me. I walked the rooms one by one, as if presence alone could reclaim them. I sat on the old couch where Dad used to doze and traced the seam where the fabric had worn thin over years of use. I ran my fingers along the stair, rail I'd sanded and stained myself. 100 tiny hours of my life pressed into that wood. Memories bubbled up unbidden. Mom's humming as she folded laundry. Dad's toolbox rattling in the garage. Ryan and I arguing over who'd get the last slice of pie. Each memory was a stitched seam in the life I'd known. And now someone had pulled at that thread. I kept replaying the phone call in my head until the words had jagged edges. The part that hurt most wasn't the theft, it was the deliberate betrayal. You can forgive an accident. You can sometimes forgive a mistake. But you don't forgive the person who plans the hurt like a business deal. My mind drifted back to small moments I'd overlooked. The way Ryan lingered a little too long at family meetings. The way he'd ask about money with a casual laugh. How he'd suddenly be wearing nicer shoes after one quiet weekend. I'd brushed it off because I wanted to believe in him. Because I wanted to believe blood meant something. That faith felt like a naive wound now. Raw and exposed. Anger flared hot and bright. But beneath it was something older and slower. A steady, cold resolve that surprised me. I had spent years being the responsible one. I had been the steady presence. The one who paid bills and fixed leaks, and chose to build rather than run. That wasn't weakness. It was proof. I made a promise in the dark of that living room. Voice low so the house wouldn't stir. If Ryan wanted a war, he'd get out. One. But it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be broken glass and screaming. It would be quiet and precise. The kind of justice that shows up with receipts and witnesses and the smell of coffee at 3 a.m. as you organize. Every piece of truth until there's nowhere left to hide. The first thing I did the next morning was go through Dad's files. I opened drawers I'd never opened since the funeral, flipping through papers that smelled like old ink and dust. Some of it was ordinary insurance forms, warranty papers, but when I found the original will tucked behind a stack of unpaid hospital bills, my chest hitched. Dad had written things in that will in his careful, slanted script. He'd left the house to me, not to both of us. To me, holding that paper was like touching a relic. My hands shook, part fear, part defiance. I tucked the will into my jacket and walked to the registrar's office. Not trusting the clerk I'd seen the other day to keep anything confidential. I needed more than the will. I needed to find out how Ryan had managed to bypass signature verifications. How he'd convinced a system built on trust to accept a lie. I sat in my car outside Ryan's apartment later that afternoon, watching him through the window as he laughed over beers with friends. He looked smaller than he had at the funeral, the bravado a mask. He lit a cigarette with slow, careless movements. Every puff he exhaled felt like a little white flag waved in triumph. Over me? But watching him I felt something else too. Not pity exactly, but a hardening. I thought about all the hours I'd spent in this house, scraping wallpaper at midnight, fixing the twist in the porch steps so a neighbor wouldn't trip, mending toys for kids who came by. I thought about the promises I'd made to my father when he asked me, weak and honest, to keep the house safe. Those promises weren't just words. They were contracts written in the quiet of every little chore. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I started writing a list. Contacts, dates, possible witnesses, anything that could lay a path back to the truth. It was methodical work born from a place colder than anger, the place where survival chooses patience over spectacle. If Ryan had staged a theft, he'd left a trail. People who cheat often leave crumbs. And I had nowhere left to hide from those crumbs except to follow them. So I sat at my kitchen table until dawn. Lamp casting a narrow cone of light over my notes. The house breathing around me like a living thing that remembers. Outside the neighborhood stirred awake, unaware that one of its houses was the center of a quiet war. I folded the paper carefully and put it in a drawer where Dad used to keep his most important things. It felt good to have a plan. I didn't want to become someone who fights with everyone. I didn't want my life to be consumed by the grudge. But standing in that kitchen, I understood the difference between surviving and surrendering. Ryan had made a choice. I was about to make mine. Asterisk, I woke up the next morning with one thing beating in my skull like a drum. I'm not letting Ryan get away with this. The idea of him sleeping under the same sky that covered the house he'd stolen felt obscene. It felt like the world had tilted and everyone else was still pretending the horizon was straight. I knew this wouldn't be solved with anger alone. Ryan was slick. His smile had always been a well-practiced mask. He had planned this. But what he hadn't counted on was that I knew the small, stupid details The places Dad hid receipts, the way he dated letters in the margins, the old filing system he'd used when he thought no one was watching. Those habits were my map. The first place I went was the study. Dust hung in the slotted light like a second memory. Drawers creaked open with that familiar domestic sound that used to mean comfort. I sifted through folders until my fingers brushed. A thin brown envelope tucked behind a stack of faded county maps. My chest tightened so much I thought I might fold in on myself. Dad's slanted handwriting stared back at me. Property and final wishes. I remember the weight of that envelope in my hands. It felt heavier than paper, like the gravity of everything it meant. Inside was the original will, folded carefully into thirds, ink slightly faded but impossible to misread. My name was written there in his careful hand. The house was left explicitly to me. Reading it, tears blurred the paper, not just for grief, but for the raw, aching injustice of what Ryan had done. I needed someone who understood these old things. Someone who'd known Dad as more than an obligation, or a rumor. I drove to Mr. Callahan's office. The street smelled of damp and old men's cologne. The lobby light hummed like a tired bulb. He looked up when I walked in, and for a second I saw sympathy in his face. The kind of sympathy that remembers a man in his prime, not just the lump of bones they'd buried last week. "Aaron," he said, voice soft, "what brings you here?" I set the will between us and told him everything. Every hollow in my chest poured into the space between the ticking clock and the smell of bitter coffee. When he read the document, his fingers traced the ink like a priest's blessing, a relic. Then he looked at me, and something in his eyes shifted from polite concern to professional focus. "This is your father's real signature," he said slowly, "but the county's transfer shows a digital submission, no original ink. Whoever did this used a digital route." "That's a different animal. What does that mean?" My voice was tight, brittle. "It means he probably forged something, electronically, or bribed someone. If you want to expose Ryan, you will need more than a will. You need intent. You need a trail. Intent. A legal muscle I'd never had to flex." But the thought didn't frighten me, it steadied me. I left with my shoulders set a little straighter, the will folded carefully in my jacket like armor. Back home, I started mapping everything. Who had access to Dad's files at the county office? Who'd handled the transfer? When had Ryan been in town? Dad's old desk became my command center. I made lists, names, dates, small, suspicious things I'd dismissed before. I printed copies, labeled them, put them in manila folders with sticky tabs. The work was methodical and strangely soothing. It turned rage into action. I also started collecting evidence quietly. I went back to the county registrar and asked questions with the tone of a worried son, not an accuser. The clerk was polite, habitual, the kind of person who had an answer for everything until I mentioned a specific timestamp on the transfer. Her demeanor changed. She shifted weight, glanced around. People who are used to protecting systems sometimes forget how fragile those systems can be. That night, I sat in my car outside Ryan's apartment watching him. He was loud and careless on the balcony, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, laughing, with friends who didn't know the shape of what he'd stolen. I recorded nothing obvious then, just notes. Little observations, the kind of normal details that would form scaffolding for larger proof. The dates he was in town, the nights. He didn't work. The sudden cash for a new jacket. People never budget for hubris. I found allies in small, unexpected places. The neighbor who'd seen Ryan argue quietly with a man in a suit near the county building. A temp at the registrar who remembered a late-night USB drive and an apology whispered about making things happen. Each person who agreed to speak gave me a new tile to lay in a mosaic of the truth. I also began to record not of spite alone, but because memory is treacherous and systems are brittle. I recorded phone messages, call logs, and the whispers of people who'd grown tired of secrecy. There was a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. "Left late on a Friday. We can get it handled," a voice said. "We know how to make signatures look legit." I listened to it until the tape fuzzed. Emotionally, the work was a slow grind. There were nights I let the grief wash over me like tide, that helpless rage curling up into panic. I would wake, and the house would feel too big. The silence reminding me of dinners when Dad had tried to teach me something, and I'd been too young to listen. I pressed both palms to the wood of the stair rail Dad had sanded and carved out, a steadiness I didn't feel. Anger fed the work, but patience finished it, and there was a darker pulse beneath it, the idea of revenge. Not a cartoonish gratification, but a patient, surgical undoing, the exposure of lies in daylight so that no one could pretend ignorance anymore. I wasn't preparing to burn him to the ground. I was preparing to make the truth, the light in which everyone could see him clearly. One late night, I compiled everything into a folder so thick it made the drawer bulge. Emails, timestamps, witness names, the original will, and a note I had scribbled in the margin. "Follow the money." The line felt like an oath. I locked the drawer with the same key Dad had used for decades and sat back, for the first time since I read that transfer notice. I slept a shaky, thin sleep filled with plans. From then on, nothing was casual. I answered Ryan's texts with calm brevity. I kept my movements quiet, my conversations conservative. I started to plan not how to break him, but how to restore what was true. Because proof was not just legal, proof was moral. It would tell the story in a language the rest of the world had to understand. I whispered the promise again into the warmed wood of the banister. You took my home, Ryan. Now I'll take back everything you stole, piece by piece. And this time, the words felt less like a threat and more like an unfolding design I intended to finish. Days blurred into a kind of tunnel where everything I did had a single aim: collect, confirm, and corner the truth. I stopped answering Ryan's late-night texts with anything longer than 3 words. I stopped pretending dinner invites were safe. Every minute had the thin edge of purpose now, a quiet sharpening. Ryan thought I was broken. That was his mistake. He'd watched me fold myself into the background for so long that he believed I would fold again, melt away and leave him to enjoy whatever hollow victory he'd carve. He didn't understand that some promises, the ones you make in the dark with a man who taught you how to hammer a nail straight, lodge themselves in your bones. Those promises made me steady. They made me relentless. I started small and precise. The real estate officer who'd processed the transfer was the first real lead. When I walked into his little office, I felt a childish, ridiculous flare of anger, the type that wanted to shout, to make him look me in the eye and confess. Instead, I kept my voice low and patient. I unfolded the email trail Ryan had left, improperly secured, on a shared drive. The moment I showed it to him, his face changed. He sat back like a man who'd been punched. Look, he whispered, eyes darting to the window as if someone might hear. Your brother offered me a big cut to push the papers through without verification. I swear I didn't know it was fraud. I thought I was helping family. Hearing confessions spoken out loud didn't feel like triumph at first. It felt hollow, like scraping a wound open and realizing the infection ran deeper than you wanted. But it was proof. It was the first concrete thing I could lay before others, a thread I could follow to the center of the rotting weave. Next. Kane Linda. I didn't expect to find an ally in her, but people who have been used and discarded often carry an honesty that's sharp and unforgiving. When I told her why I was there, she didn't blink. Her face hardened the way a struck knife glances off metal. He always thought he was smarter than everyone, she said, voice low and bitter. He bragged about getting the house from you. He said you'd never see it coming, said Aaron's too soft. Her words hit like a confirmation, and yet they did something else. They cracked open a part of me that had been tightened too long. There was grief there I hadn't fully felt, for the brother I wanted, for the man I should have been able to trust. I recorded everything, every scrap of confession, every trembling laugh he used to hide fear. Each recording became a tile in a mosaic that, when assembled, made a picture no one could deny. Preparing the confrontation felt less dramatic in the planning and more surgical. I didn't want a scene of shouting and broken plates. I wanted a moment where the truth hung up like a new curtain and everyone finally saw what had been behind it. The family dinner came together like a stage. Invitations were sent, plotters ordered, and the dining room, the one where we'd celebrated birthdays and smallest triumphs, became the theater of reckoning. Walking into that room, I felt 100 small things at once. The weight of every late-night fix I'd done in that house. The sting of being dismissed as too emotional. The years of bearing a quiet indoor. People murmured my name with that puzzled tilt that says, "What happened to your usual softness?" Ryan smiled. An automatic, rehearsed gesture that always had a hollow center, he said at first with that practiced charm. Well, look who finally decided to show up. I sat down as if nothing was happening, as if I came to family dinners with nothing on my agenda except to eat. My hands were steady when I stood. The room quieted with the gravity you get from a man who no longer wants to plead. He wants to present. There's something I need to share, I said. Something about Dad's house. Ryan's face tightened. Aaron, not now, he started. I ignored him and connected my phone to the speaker. There was no melodrama in the press of a button, just a calm, clinical turning of the key. The recording of the real estate officer filled the room, a voice small and shaky, but precise. Your brother offered me a big cut to push the papers through. Then Linda's voice, clear and steady. He bragged about getting the house from you. The world narrowed to the sound of truth being played through a speaker. The room went silent in that way. The silence does when something fragile cracks. Eyes moved. Conversations died mid-sentence. My uncle's jaw clenched, and he stood, rigid as if the room were a courtroom. Ryan was pale, his smile stripped away, leaving a raw, embarrassed animal who'd realized the net had closed. This is a joke, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. No, I said. My voice didn't tremble. It's the truth. The house isn't yours. It was never yours. You forged Dad's will, bribed an officer, and lied to everyone in this room. I laid down the original will, the paper that smelled of old ink, and my father's breathy handwriting. It was a small, simple thing that held in it a life, and a promise. When it landed on the table, all the pomp and posture that Ryan wore flaked away. He pushed his chair back, muttered under his breath some half-protests, some excuse, and stormed out. He left with the kind of rattled silence that makes a person look smaller than they did that morning. The exit slammed like finality. For a few seconds, disbelief and a strange relief ran through me. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks lifted just enough to let in air. People came to me after, with hands on shoulders, with apologies that felt like band-aids. Some faces were ashamed, some were stunned, but the truth had been said aloud, and that mattered more than the polite repair of relationships. Yet even in that small victory, I knew the war wasn't over. Legal maneuvers could come next. Ryan could and probably would lash out in ways I hadn't planned for. Dignity can turn to spite when it's stripped bare. I'd seized a moment, but I also made myself visible, a target perhaps. Still, I felt different for the first time in a long while. I felt like the man who'd promised my father he'd keep the house safe. I had not only the will tucked in my jacket, but witnesses, recordings, and the kind of moral clarity that doesn't dissolve in the face of family politics. Walking back to the car, the night air smelled of summer rain. I thought of Dad in his faded work shirt, covered in sawdust, humbly proud of a job done right. This felt like finishing a job my father had started. It felt like honoring him in a way that didn't require sermons or speeches, only the quiet, stubborn act of standing up and filing truth where lies had been kept. As I drove away, I whispered, the same promise I'd made months before, not as a threat now, but as a vow. I will finish this. I will prove what is mine. I will not let him rewrite the life we built. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I believed I could walk it without falling back into the man who tolerated theft for the sake of peace. The days after the confrontation felt strangely quiet, like the calm after a storm. No messages, no calls, not even a single word from Ryan, the same brother who once called me 3 times. A day to argue about meaningless things had vanished into silence. For a brief moment, I let myself believe it was over, that he had finally realized what he'd done and chosen to stay away. But somewhere deep inside, I knew Ryan too well. He wasn't the kind to surrender. He was just regrouping. A week later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject line, urgent lawsuit filed. My stomach twisted as I opened it. Ryan was suing me, for defamation, he claimed. I had tarnished his reputation and fabricated lies in front of family and friends. I couldn't help but laugh a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed through my empty living room. It was so predictable. So Ryan, when cornered, he didn't apologize, he attacked. But this time, I was ready. The courthouse smelled of old wood and tension. Every echoing footstep reminded me that this wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a war for truth. I walked in beside my lawyer, carrying a folder thick with evidence, emails, bank statements, and voice recordings. Ryan was already seated across the aisle. He looked different, pale, thinner, tired. But that smirk, that familiar smirk still lingered, as if he believed he could twist his way out again. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Case number 4827, Holloway versus Holloway. Hearing our last name said like that, cold, distant, stripped of meaning hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about the ruins of what used to be a family. The proceedings began. Ryan's lawyer stood up first, painting him as the victim of my malicious accusations. Every sentence felt like poison, carefully crafted, detached from the truth. When my turn came, my lawyer rose calmly and said, Your Honor, the defense is ready to present evidence proving that Mr. Ryan Holloway not only falsified documents, but also bribed an officer to execute an illegal property transfer. I could see Ryan shift in his seat. His confidence faltered for the first time. We started playing the recordings. The real estate officer's nervous voice filled the courtroom. Your brother offered me a cut to push the transfer without verification. Then Linda's testimony. He bragged about it, said his brother would never see it coming. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Finally, my lawyer placed the original will on the table, sealed, verified, signed in my father's unmistakable handwriting. The judge leaned forward, brows furrowed. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke. Mr. Ryan Holloway, this court finds your lawsuit without merit. You are fortunate your brother hasn't filed criminal charges for forgery and fraud. I suggest you walk away before you lose more than your reputation. Ryan's face drained of color. His hands trembled. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. Outside the courthouse, the cold wind cut across the steps as I stood there, breathing in the quiet victory. Then I heard his voice behind me. Aaron. I turned. He looked smaller than ever. His eyes were red, not from anger this time, but from shame. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said softly. I studied him for a long time. We shared the same childhood, the same home, the same father's love. But standing there, it felt like we were strangers to men, divided by choices that could never be undone. I know, I finally said. But meaning doesn't undo the damage. Ryan, you crossed a line. You can't step back. He nodded slowly, looked down at the ground, and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw him. Months passed. Dad's house finally felt like mine again. No papers, no battles, no tension, just quiet. Some nights, I'd sit on the same porch where Dad once sat, the wood creaking beneath my chair, the sunset painting the sky orange and gold. I could almost hear his voice. Boys, family means everything. For years, I thought that line was dead, buried under lies and betrayal. But I realized something sitting there in the soft light. Family isn't blood. It's trust. It's respect. It's love that doesn't come with conditions. And the day Ryan chose greed over truth, he stopped being my family. I stood, locked the gate behind me. I had to take one last look at the home that had witnessed every chapter of my life. The laughter, the pain, the betrayal, and finally, the justice. Then I turned away, walking toward the horizon, feeling lighter than I had in years. Because sometimes, closure isn't about forgiveness. It's about knowing you survived the fire and still found the strength to walk away without ever looking back.